Okay, so picture this. 1931, Long Beach, New York. A young woman, Starr Faithfull, her body washes up on the shore. It's a scene that, well, nearly a century on, still holds this intense mystery. How did she end up there?
It really does stick with you. And for this deep dive, you've given us a really fascinating set of sources, historical accounts, some deep analysis, uh, insights not just into what happened, but the whole world around it.
Exactly. So, our mission for you today together is to sort of unpack these sources. We want to pull out the key insights they offer and try to understand not just the surface facts, but the powerful undercurrents. Was it suicide, an accident,
Hmm.
murder? And what does it tell us about that time?
Yeah, the scene itself is just so stark, isn't it? Star Faithful, deceased on the beach. And as your sources point out immediately, that discovery kicks off this central, enduring puzzle: suicide, accident, or murder. That question really is the core of what these analyses are wrestling with.
But, to even start making sense of what happened on that beach, we have to go way, way deeper. We need to talk about the profound trauma, the life-shaping stuff Star Faithful was carrying long before that day. The sources you shared make it so clear her story isn't just about her death, it's deeply about her life.
Oh, absolutely. The sources really dig into the abuse she suffered, Andrew J.
Mm,
Peters. And what's critical here, as the analysis really underscores, is Peters' position. I mean, this wasn't just anyone. He was a powerful public figure,
right?
right?
A big name.
Yeah, a family man, seemed respectable on the surface, but he engaged in this prolonged sexual abuse of a child star who was essentially under his guardianship. It's just a horrific betrayal on so many levels, kind of enabled by his status, you know?
And the way the sources analyze Peter's psychology is pretty chilling. They talk about severe psychopathology, suggesting things like narcissist personality disorder, possibly pedophilic tendencies. What really jumps out is this profound sense of entitlement they attribute to him, and this, frankly, terrifying ability to compartmentalize, to just wall off his public life from these horrific private actions.
And then there's the financial settlement. The sources shed light on this too,
Uh,
how he made this payment after the family found out about the abuse. It's presented less as, genuine remorse and more as a very calculated move.
Damage control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Protecting his reputation above all else. The analysis suggests his priorities were just cold, self-serving, keep the image intact, forget about the immense harm caused.
Which just tragically leads us straight back to Starr herself.
Yeah.
The sources draw this powerful, really heartbreaking line connecting that devastating trauma to her later behavior.
Yes, the analysis directly links the abuse to what came next for her. Things like self-destructive behavior, addiction. It frames her internal struggle, choices that might seem, well, confusing from the outside as a direct and tragic consequence of that trauma. It wasn't random. It was trauma-driven psychology playing out.
And Starr's struggle, it didn't happen in a vacuum, did it? The sources really hammer this home we have to see her life and how people judged it through the specific, often pretty harsh, lens of the Jazz Age, the 1920s, the 30s.
That societal backdrop is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
The sources talk about how society, the press back then, viewed women, sexuality, mental health.
Yeah.
It was different. Starr's perceived promiscuity, her self-destructive actions, regardless of the trauma root,
Right.
they were judged incredibly harshly. And especially because she was a woman. This really plays into that whole fallen woman trope.
Ah, yes, that damaging idea.
Totally. Blaming women for their own misfortunes or, societal condemnation, especially if they didn't fit into these really narrow boxes about how women should behave sexually.
Heavy media.
Yeah.
Wow. They really seized on that narrative, didn't they? The sources break down how the press portrayed Starr,
Yeah.
often just sensationalizing parts of her life, her alleged relationships, her struggles with addiction.
Hmm.
And this sensationalism, the sources argue, it might have just completely overshadowed the fact that she was a victim, the trauma underneath it all. One really interesting point the sources make is if you compare different newspaper accounts from the time, you can actually see the different biases at play. It's quite stark.
And crucially, the understanding back then, or maybe the profound misunderstanding of childhood sexual abuse and the trauma that results, it was just worlds away from where we are now. Victims often got blamed. There wasn't really a societal framework to even recognize the deep psychological impact, let alone offer, proper support.
And thinking about mental health treatments back then, the sources mention things like sanatoriums being common for addiction, for example. But they raise some pretty big questions about the quality of care, the actual understanding of these complex issues. It probably wasn't the most supportive place for someone grappling with that kind of deep trauma.
Which naturally leads us to another really critical person in Starr's life, someone the sources delve into: her mother. Helen Faithfull.
Okay, so what do the sources tell us about Helen's role? What was her part in all this?
Well, they explore her level of awareness about the abuse, like how much did she actually know? And when did she know it? And then how did she react? Both right away and sort of over time. Her reactions, the sources suggest, were, well, incredibly complex.
And that financial settlement from Peters you mentioned, how did that affect things within the family between Helen and Starr?
That's a huge question the sources raise. Did it create this awkward sense of complicity? Maybe even resentment towards Starr herself, potentially making it even harder for Starr to get the understanding or support she needed from within her own family.
That's rough.
Yeah. And then you look at Helen's statements, her actions after Starr died. The sources kind of push you to ask, was she genuinely fighting for justice for her daughter? Or was she maybe also worried about protecting the family name? Or perhaps even the terms of that settlement agreement? It just adds another really difficult, murky layer to the whole tragedy when you start exploring her potential motivations.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. The sources also try to piece together Starr's final days, right? Mapping out that known timeline.
You do. They review the details we have, like that reported trip on the RMS Franconia, her last known letters or calls, various sightings that were reported. But what this section in the sources really drives home is just how many ambiguities there are, how many missing pieces.
It's not straightforward.
Not at all. It's not just a simple A to B path. There are inconsistencies, conflicting reports.
And that specific journey from wherever she was last definitively seen to ending up dead on that Long Beach shore, the sources flag that gap as just a critical, unsolved piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Whether her death was ultimately suicide or an accident or foul play, how she physically got to that beach, that remains the central question the material just can't nail down. There were conflicting accounts about when she left the ship, gaps in timing. It's just not clear.
Which ultimately forces us, and you listening, to grapple with the whole idea of justice in this case, as your sources frame it. It's ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, even if her death wasn't legally ruled a homicide, let's say it was determined to be a suicide or maybe an accident directly resulting from the immense psychological distress Peters caused,
Right.
it raises this profound ethical and psychological question that the sources really compel us to think about.
Yeah.
Could Peters still be considered morally responsible for her death?
Meaning, did his actions ultimately set the stage? Did they create the psychological state that led to her end, even if it wasn't something you could, prosecute him for in court?
Exactly. That's the uncomfortable question.
And a really significant, frankly infuriating part of this whole tragedy, which the sources really highlight, is that Peters largely got away with it. He
Right.
escaped public accountability for the horrific abuse he inflicted,
Yeah.
and the material points to a couple of reasons. Partly that settlement he engineered, basically buying silence, buying protection, and partly just the prevailing attitudes of the time, which were often unwilling or maybe just ill-equipped to hold powerful men like him fully accountable for that kind of abuse.
So it makes you wonder, why does this case, with all its layers, its tragedy, its lack of innate conclusion about how she died, why does it still fascinate us so much today?
Yeah, why do so many people still talk about Starr Faithfull? The sources toss out a few potential reasons for this enduring grip it has on us. Is it maybe the lingering glamour of the jazz age itself, creating this stark contrast with the darkness underneath?
It could be. Or maybe just the sheer raw tragedy of Starr's life and death.
Or the powerful figures involved, like Peters, the questions of power, privilege, abuse of trust.
Or maybe, it's simply the pull of an unsolved mystery. The fact that the absolute definitive truth about how Starr Faithfull ended up on that beach is likely just lost. We'll probably never know for sure.
And the sources also touch on the cultural echoes, don't they? How Starr's story, or at least bits and pieces of it, resonated so deeply that it's been cited as possible inspiration, or at least parallels, in books and films from or about that era. It shows how her story really left a mark.
It certainly did. It lodged itself in the cultural consciousness.
So there you have it, our deep dive into the incredibly complex, undeniably tragic case of Starr Faithfull. We've looked at the devastating trauma she endured at the hands of Peters, the harsh societal spotlight of the jazz age that judged her so fiercely, the difficult dynamics within her own family, especially with her mother, and these lingering, frustrating questions about her final hours and what justice even means in her story.
It's a story just layered with power, abuse, societal judgment, family secrets, and ultimately, so many unresolved questions about her death.
And it really leaves you with something to chew on, a final thought drawn from these sources. What does Starr Faithfull's case, even looking back from today, ultimately reveal about the long shadow cast by power imbalances, by unchecked abuse, and maybe about the way society still grapples, or perhaps often fails to grapple, with uncomfortable truths about its own judgments and complicity?